So last week, in just her second show hosting BBC Question Time, the BBC's flagship current affairs and politics programme, Fiona Bruce, it turned out, caused a great deal of controversy. Her guests included Kirsty Blackman from the SNP, Rory Stewart from the Conservatives, Anand Menon, a professor at King's College London, and Isabel Oakeshott. But of course, everybody was talking about the way in which Diane Abbott, the Labour Shadow Home Secretary, was treated. Now, I've already done two videos covering last week's BBC Question Time, one focusing on how both Isabel Oakeshott and Fiona Bruce got the polling completely wrong in regards to Labour and the Tory party, and a second video just covering the everyday forms of pernicious racism that I think infect broader public conversation at an unconscious systemic level. Now, I want to talk about both of those things once more because they were almost the outstanding moments where you could see a discernible bias against Diane Abbott, but I also want to provide a broader sketch of what was going on because it really was a deluge of, like I say, bias. And that wasn't just because Diane Abbott is a black woman, I believe. It wasn't just because she's there representing Labour. It's there because she's also, alongside all of that, reflecting a radical socialist politics which has been ignored or been the subject of mockery by the establishment for years. That has now changed. And for one of its figureheads, for, like I say, to be a black woman from a working class background, clearly gets these people's backs up. Now, I've done this video not just because I want to focus on last week's BBC Question Time, because I think it also expresses broader trends replete throughout the media in terms of what voices are deemed to be legitimate and authoritative and what ones aren't. So with no further ado, let's start with the introductions of the guests, particularly Diane Abbott.
Good evening, welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, we have Rory Stewart, the government's prison minister, a former Foreign Office minister. He was also deputy governor of 2 Iraqi provinces after the war. Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, an MP for more than 30 years, and a member of Jeremy Corbyn's close circle, Diane Abbott. Kirsty Blackman, the SNP's spokesperson on the economy and deputy leader of the party at Westminster. Anand Menon, Professor of European Politics at King's College London and the director of a think tank which specialises in the UK's relations with the EU. And last but not least, political journalist, author and ardent Brexiteer, I think it's fair to say, Isabel Oakeshott.
Now, this is interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, each guest, with the exception of Diane Abbott, is there effectively because of their own merits. Kirsty Blackman is there because she holds formal roles within the SNP. Isabel Oakeshott is there because she's a journalist and author. The academic from King's College London has 2 roles, one with a think tank, one as an academic, obviously. Diane Abbott, we're told, is a Shadow Home Secretary, yes, correct. We're told she's been an MP for several decades, yes, correct. And that she's also an ally of Jeremy Corbyn. This is the first black woman MP to be in the Houses of Parliament. She's been there since 1987. That's a major role. You know, it's like the first woman in Parliament, the first working class person in Parliament, the first democratically elected Parliament. We talk about the Great Reform Act 1832, the various Reform Acts. There's a story of democracy in this country, and Diane Abbott's a part of it. The first black woman elected to Parliament in 1987. And yet that went unmentioned. And I think that by itself is quite bad. But instead of that not being mentioned, it was mentioned she's an ally of Jeremy Corbyn. You know, nobody else caught that. We're not told that Isabel Oakeshott is a close political ally of Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks. In a way, that should be immaterial because we want a balance of voices. But if it's going to be said about Diane Abbott, why isn't it being said about Isabel Oakeshott? Why is it only left-wingers who are introduced as such? Diane Abbott for 30 years has been a civil libertarian, she's been a socialist, she's been an anti-racist. Why not introduce her as one of those things rather than an ally of Jeremy Corbyn? Now, right-wing voices, including a gentleman who wrote an article for Conservative Home, it was shared by Isabel Oakeshott, there was no evidence in it. He just said, oh, Diane Abbott had a car crash, a nightmare, made loads of mistakes. She didn't actually, she had about 8 out of 10 show, no factual inaccuracies, no big mistakes with numbers. She was very calm, very authoritative, coherent arguments. Watch the show. We're going to start with one right now. She makes point after point, very, very authoritative, very credible. You decide whether you agree with me.
And I have to say, people are saying that Jeremy Corbyn won't talk to Theresa May. In September, at Labour Party conference, in terms, the leader of the Labour Party said that if the Prime Minister offered a deal on these lines, a customs union, close relationship with the single market, and some guarantee of rights at work, he was prepared to work with her on it.
Now that's right at the top of the programme. Fiona Bruce will try and paint Diane Abbott as it unfolds as being mercurial, evading questions. But right at the top of the show, Diane Abbott is saying, well, actually, you're wrong. Here's why. Here's the proof. And these are our major hurdles in terms of coming to a compromise, particularly a customs union, particularly access to the single market. Very, very clear and authoritative. But as we'll go on to see, Fiona Bruce is constantly trying to undermine that authority, and we just don't know why.
And we heard nothing.
Well, of course, Diane, because that is not what people voted for.
Now, we'll repeatedly see this. This is Isabel Oakeshott interrupting Diane Abbott. She knows what she's doing. Personally, if I'm a chair or a host, I have no problem with people doing that. You need to have some give, right? It needs to be a dynamic conversation. You want to entertain the audience, that's fine. There's a little bit of interrupting from one another. I get that. But as we'll find out, only Isabel Oakeshott is allowed to do it. Again, you have to ask the question, why?
Let me finish. We heard nothing, the phone didn't ring. And after 2 years, for Theresa May to be phoning random Labour MPs last week was quite extraordinary.
Okay, to repeat, the kind of safe space for right-wingers when they slag off Diane Abbott is to say, oh, she's incoherent, she had a car crash. Like I say, there was a piece written on Conservative Home by some little luggage carrier for Isabel Oakeshott. She tweeted it, got more than 1,000 retweets, how terrible Diane Abbott was. Straight off the bat, she's told the audience, the people at home, here are sort of what Labour really thinks about stumbling blocks to a compromise. Here's why you're wrong. Here's where Jeremy Corbyn was open to negotiation. And the first audience kind of applause is for Diane Abbott, despite the fact she's being interrupted by Isabel Oakeshott.
The problem has been all along that she didn't reach out to the House of Commons as a whole.
Yeah, but hang on, Diane.
Again, second applause of the programme, it's for Diane Abbott. Now it's not Isabel Oakeshott that's interrupting, it's Fiona Bruce.
Hang on, Diane. You've got a situation now where Jeremy Corbyn won't talk to Theresa May without a precondition. We'll get onto that, without no deal coming off the table. So he's writing to her, she's writing to him. Why don't they just talk?
We would have...
So a few things here. Look at Rory Stewart's smile. He's been briefed, you know, you're going to go on BBC Question Time. We've just had the biggest defeat of the government ever in the history of British, not even democracy, the pre-democratic era. Even the Long Parliament, which ended up killing Charles I, didn't defeat the government like this. Really, it has no precedent, so he's been briefed, this is going to be terrible, batter everything away, have a big smile on your face. But all of the focus is on Diane Abbott, and as you can see from his smile, he thinks all his Christmases have come at once. And not just Isabel Oakeshott's interrupting Diane Abbott, it's also the host. And as you'll notice, this point is made by Fiona Bruce. You can agree or disagree with it. It seems like strange chairing, but what's really interesting is that after she does that, you can hear a snort in the microphone.
Why don't they just talk?
Again, that's from Isabel Oakeshott. She's very clever. She knows what she's doing. If I was a right-winger, I would want her on the television. And then she starts clapping close to the microphone so you can hear it extra loud. And these are the little tricks of the trade that she's using to undermine Diane Abbott, as long as as well as the sort of continuous interrupting, as we'll find out. Often it's with points that are completely untrue. She is never once corrected, by the way, by the hosts. This picture here shows you everything you need to know. Rory Stewart is smiling. Kirsty Blackman, you can't even really see her. Isabel Oakeshott is snorting and interrupting. And Fiona Bruce is kind of like quite imperious looking at Diane Abbott. You don't even need to watch the programme. That picture, that shot, sums up the entire show. So how the hell is that impartial?
We would have...
Look at the size of the guy's smile. This is a government which has had 32 resignations since June 2017. First defeat of a government on a finance bill for 40 years. Biggest defeat of a government ever. And he's laughing. He's laughing. Again, if you want an image as to why this show in no way embodies impartiality or accuracy, look at Rory Stewart's face.
We would have loved to talk. That's why Jeremy had it in his conference speech in September. And it's important to remind people of that.
But why not now? Why not now? Because now is now. There's no point in harking back to what was months ago.
Isabel, if you just...
Again, she looks authoritative, in receipt of the facts. Far from the cliche, inaccurate by the way, peddled of her by the right-wing press. And again, we see that she's just being constantly prodded and interrupted by Isabel Oakeshott. And it has to be said, this is not called out once by Fiona Bruce. Fiona Bruce is not mentioning it. So what the hell is going on?
Now, because now is now. There's no point in harking back to what was months ago.
Isabel, if you just let me finish.
Now this is pretty amazing. Not only does Fiona Bruce do nothing when Isabel Oakeshott repeatedly interrupts Diane Abbott, here you can see she actually joins in the fun. It's almost like Isabel Oakeshott is acting as a cue for Fiona Bruce. She should be saying, Isabel, let her finish her point. You are repeatedly doing this, but instead she joins in the action. It's like a 1-2. It's like Sutton and Shearer, York and Cole, Turner and Hooch. You think of a great dynamic duo. Well, we can now add to that long list Isabel Oakeshott and Fiona Bruce. What's going on?
Jeremy sometimes says you have to talk to people with whom you profoundly disagree. He was talking about Hezbollah and Hamas.
I mean, this is wild. Wild. Wow, we're talking about Brexit. We're less than 10 minutes into the programme. It's Fiona Bruce's second ever show. And she starts talking about, not like the right wing, not like Julia Hartley-Brewer, the right wing gunslinger, but they have a role on the show, that's fine. Some people in Britain think like that, they should be reflected in the panel, I get it. The host shouldn't say that. And by the way, the Daily Express, it did 2 very favourable articles about Fiona Bruce in Question Time the next day. The Daily Express. What kind of a right-wing freak show is the BBC harbouring when the Daily Express isn't just repeating something said by the right-wing sort of guest, by the chair? And by the way, Fiona Bruce, would you like to know who else recommended talking to Hamas and Hezbollah? Tony Blair, Barack Obama, John Kerry, and 10 years ago, no less than Mike Gapes, said that Tony Blair was doing the right thing talking to Hamas. So is it only a problem when the people you don't like, the people you disagree with, Jeremy Corbyn, it becomes a sort of an object of ridicule, an opportunity to sort of kick the left? Or is it something you're consistent on? Have you ever talked about how Tony Blair negotiated with Hamas or John Kerry?
Just to get back to Brexit, the reason that we are saying that we wanted to take no deal off the table, we thought that was one of the easiest things you could concede on.
Because it's the law, Diane. No deal is the law.
Another interruption by Isabel Oakeshott. Again, unchallenged, not told to be quiet. It's only coming from her, and it's never, ever, ever called out by the chair.
That's what will happen.
So why was Philip Hammond calling business people a few days ago, promising them that Parliament could block no deal? We asked her to do that because we thought it was the easiest thing for her to concede. Even members of the cabinet are against no deal.
Now, this is pretty remarkable. Diane Abbott highlights a story about the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, the second most important person in terms of the UK government, telling businesses that there would not be no deal. And it's just remarkable that she brings that up. Fiona Bruce is the chair. Wow, the second most powerful person in the British government is directly contradicting the arguments made by the Prime Minister. But apparently that's not sufficiently important to be discussed on BBC Question Time. Who knew?
Are against no deal. We know manufacturers in parts of the country like this are against no deal. It would be catastrophic. And actually, in terms of the safety of the realm, if we come out with no deal and no transition period, all sorts of security and policing arrangements will fall. We thought it was the easiest thing to concede. She hasn't conceded it. And if I was
it's not the easiest thing for her to concede, Diane.
Because our cabinet don't want it.
But you know it's not the easiest thing for her to concede.
You know it's not the easiest thing for her to concede. You know, she says it twice. You know, she's telling her facts. What? Is this chairing? Really? You'd rather say, you know it's not the easiest thing for her to concede, rather than say, well, that's true, isn't it? Philip Hammond's saying one thing, the Prime Minister's saying another. No, rather she'd second guess her. You know it's not the easiest thing and put her down like a school kid.
I don't want it. And if I was a manufacturer or worker in this region, I would be very frightened indeed that Theresa May still sees no deal as a viable option.
Well, Diane,
wait a minute, Rory.
It is simply impossible. Hang on, you've given me one word before you interrupt me.
So Diane Abbott gets her 4th round of applause. She makes a great point, again, very authoritative. Isabel Oakeshott says something. Diane Abbott, okay, you can say she interrupts. I think she clearly interrupts. Isabel Oakeshott's done that like 4 or 5 times. He goes, hang on, don't interrupt me. Again, she's playing that clever game. You interrupt. The second you're interrupted, call it out, look the victim. She's clapping next to the mic. She's whooping next to the mic. She's really trying to constantly put Diane Abbott off. And by the way, in a sense, again, it's fair game. In a sense, right? I wouldn't do it, but it's going to happen, which is why the BBC should try and mitigate that stuff by not having them next to each other. Just a thought, maybe seat them in different places. I mean, what do I know? I haven't been doing this show for 2 weeks.
It is simply impossible. The Prime Minister cannot rule out no deal because no deal is what the legal default is. So she would have to introduce new legislation. Diane, may I just finish my point?
Yeah, one word. Yeah, she gave you one word. Yeah, she's interrupted you once in the first 15 minutes of the show. You've interrupted her 4 or 5 times. Give me a break.
May I just finish my point? But it's not just that she can't rule out no deal. It is that she shouldn't rule out no deal. Have you ever bought a car or a house? And did you go in there saying, whatever price that car or house is, I am not walking away unless I get that car or that house? You would never do that.
This is literally the dumbest analogy I've ever heard. We're not buying anything on March the 29th, Isabel, okay? We're not buying the house. We already live in the house, and on March the 29th, the bailiffs are coming, okay? And we need to get the deal sorted. The debt collectors are on the way, right? We've got a county court judgment against us.
Like you said, most of Parliament is now do not favour no deal. Isn't that the problem, that all the voters favour no deal and the parliamentarians don't?
Absolutely.
Wait, let me get this straight. All the voters favour no deal, all the parliamentarians don't. No, I accept some people in Britain want no deal. If it was that simple, it would happen because politicians like to be re-elected. But it's not that simple. And what's even more concerning is that he says this thing which is completely incorrect. Look, he's just a member of the audience. He can have his opinion, fine. We know it's empirically not true. All the evidence says he's wrong. And Isabel Oakeshott goes, absolutely. Absolutely. Bold as brass. Absolutely. Diane Abbott, apparently, terrible with numbers. Terrible with facts. Always get things wrong. You know what? If Diane Abbott's ever got something wrong, numbers-wise, it's because it was a mistake. People don't sleep enough. They forget things. We're human. Isabel Oakeshott there clearly is intentionally lying and misrepresenting the facts for her own ends. Now again, where is Fiona Bruce? She's the chair. She should be saying, no, not absolutely. How is that true? Here's what this survey said. We know that's not the case. She's happy to say that about, it's not the easiest thing to Diane Abbott. But when Isabel Oakeshott says something completely factually inaccurate, nothing.
Moment of compromise. Which red lines would you compromise on?
Well, we have said, and we've been saying it since last year, the things that we think are important are the customs union, some sort of...
No, but we know what you think is important.
Yeah.
You said that at the beginning.
Yeah.
So what would you compromise on? Which red lines have you got that in
haven't.
a negotiation you'd be prepared to
We
compromise
have not
on?
put forward any red lines. It's only the government that's put forward red lines. That's my point.
But hang on, no red lines is no policy. You have got a policy.
We have got a policy and I've explained it.
No red lines is no policy. Is that true? No red lines is no policy. Really? Is that now if I go and look up no policy in a dictionary and say no red lines, isn't it fascinating? We've only got those kinds of pressing questions. I think this happens to be incorrect, a bad line of questioning by Fiona Bruce, but it's only going to one politician and they aren't the government minister because he's out of shot pissing himself laughing.
Exactly. So are there any areas there that you would be prepared to compromise on? A customs union, for example?
We're happy to talk to the government about some sort of movement on the customs union.
Jeremy Corbyn is not talking to the government.
Again, see, Isabel Oakeshott. Jeremy Corbyn is like, come on, this is insane. Isabel Oakeshott's playing a 1-2 with Fiona Bruce. When somebody says something fucking batshit in the audience, she's going, yes, you're absolutely right. She's interrupting Diane Abbott constantly. She says things which aren't true amongst the panel. Diane Abbott interrupts her once. She goes, will you let me finish? My God. Come on. And again, where's the chair? Where is the chair?
The only thing that we have said, and it's not popular with this audience, but I assure you it's popular with business.
And again, look, this is again, Isabel Oakeshott does this. She does this like a dozen times over the course of the show, or with anybody. Some people actually favour a customs union, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, including half of the cabinet, okay, including the likes of the CBI, and one part of the establishment, the bit of the establishment that wants to not really do Brexit, is kind of bought into the idea of a customs union. Probably most MPs, as Kirsty Blackman says, the SNP MP, elsewhere on the show. She just says something, it's a flat out lie, it's not true. Interrupting Diane Abbott, again, where's the chair? Sorry to repeat myself.
What about the 6 tests that Labour have said? One of the most interesting ones, perhaps.
Perhaps. One of the most interesting, so it's immediately sort of like, oh, these aren't serious. The government hasn't got a policy on Brexit. We're about to have no deal, and you're talking about, perhaps, that, what the fuck? And of course, these same people, if there is a no deal, and if, we have major problems, it seems likely, because we have just-in-time manufacturing, production, distribution, things could go very badly wrong. Okay, it might be rectified in a month, but does that mean people go without certain medicines, certain foodstuffs, etc.? Anyway, people like Fiona Bruce are going to blame Labour. And you say, well, Aaron, that's really conspiratorial. If we're only 2 months out from leaving the European Union and Fiona Bruce is making jokes about Labour's 6 tests, I mean, what else am I meant to think?
Is that whatever deal is done has to deliver the same benefits as being in the single market and the customs union.
That was, in fact, David Davis who said that, and we were just repeating what he'd said.
So is that not one of your 6 tests?
It is one of our 6
Oh,
tests.
right, okay.
But what
All
we
right.
were doing was repeating what, let me see, was that the
Well,
second
hang on.
or
Never
the
mind
third
that. It's
Brexit
either your test or
secretary?
it isn't your test. If it is your test...
What the fuck? What? Is that not one of your 6 tests? First of all, it's one of Labour's 6 tests, okay? It's one of Labour's 6 tests. All that Diane Abbott has said is that as a test, it was about holding the Tories' feet to the fire, making sure they kept their word.
Man there in the grey top.
You know what worries me more than Brexit? And that is if we had a general election and Labour got in, Diane Abbott would be responsible for policing, immigration and the national security.
Okay, so the gentleman's made a personal attack on Diane Abbott. By the way, I see the Tories are doing so well on policing and national security. Whatever. Theresa May was the Home Secretary of the Windrush scandal. By the way, people have died as a result of that. You have Britain going into Libya, getting rid of Gaddafi. Some of the people we were enabling to go over there, including one Salman Abedi, the Manchester bomber, they were enabled to go there. They come back. He killed dozens of people. That was on Theresa May's watch as Home Secretary. And yet, in a debate about Brexit, you're worried about Diane Abbott being the Home Secretary. Okay? And then there was this cracker from Isabel Oakeshott. It's drawn the most attention, really, towards the whole programme. She said something which was factually incorrect. Let's see what she said.
And I just want to pick up one thing that you said, Dan. I am bewildered as to why Labour is so keen for a general election. You are way behind in the polls. What makes you think that you're going to win? It is a damning indictment, isn't it, on your leadership, that even amid all this mayhem, you and your leader are miles behind the Tories.
This is a point of information. Currently, we're kind of, in the polls overall, we're kind of level pegging. We went
6 points behind.
You're behind, Diane.
Yeah, but we went into the last...
So Fiona Bruce goes, no, you're behind, Diane. First of all, Isabel Oakeshott is wrong. She's saying something which is patently untrue. Just like most people, apparently, everybody wants a no deal. Now, everybody knows that Labour are behind the polls. At the time this show was broadcast, 3 of the last 4 polls had Labour ahead. 1 had them on level pegging. What Diane Abbott said, people were, oh, she's terrible at numbers. What she said was absolutely 100% crystal clear and correct. Labour and the Tories in the poll of polls were about level pegging. Labour was slightly ahead. If you took out YouGov, nobody else was saying that Labour were behind for a long, long time. Okay? So clearly, Diane Abbott was correct. Isabel Oakeshott was wrong. That's one thing. But for Fiona Bruce to then come in and say, no, you're definitely behind, that's, again, terrible, inaccurate chairing. And where does the impetus come from to say that? Is she impartial? Or does she not just have a grasp of the basic facts? Because If she doesn't have the former, if she's not impartial, she shouldn't be hosting the show. And if she hasn't got a grasp of the basic facts, polling, how is she chairing the most important current affairs programme on the BBC?
Definitely.
Last general election, 20 points behind. And Theresa May was convinced she was going to smash us. I believe that if we could make up 20 points in the last general election, I believe we can win any forthcoming general
Well, you need to have a general election, and you're not. You've tried and you've failed so far.
I don't think hope is a strategy, Diane.
I want to move.
Now, this is a really important point. Even though Fiona Bruce and Isabel Oakeshott are incorrect, Labour are polling marginally above the Tories in polls today, it is very important, nonetheless, to say, well, given Labour made up about 15 points in the last general election, pretty sure, it's legitimate to say, at least, that they'll win the next one. I personally think Labour would easily be the largest party in Parliament. Is that enough to win a majority? Well, we'd have to be closer to the campaign, see how that unfolds. But what's interesting is that Diane Abbott in late 2016 said that Labour would make up the difference with the Tories, which at that time was significant, within 12 months. Turns out she was wrong, because Labour did it in 6. And then, in late 2016, she was lambasted by people like Fiona Bruce. I'm not saying it was Fiona Bruce, but people in senior positions in the political media class, the commentariat, people like Isabel Oakeshott, were taking the mickey out of her. What an idiot. Well, she was proven right. If anything, you could call her a visionary. Of course, nobody acknowledges that because she's just Diane Abbott. She's just the daughter of a welder who ended up in Cambridge and became the first black woman MP and who's now the Shadow Home Secretary. What could she know? But alongside all that, I found Fiona Bruce saying, well, you tried a general election, that didn't work. That's a kind of strange thing to say. First and foremost, we have the Fixed Term Parliament Act, okay? It's very hard to call a general election. The opposition certainly can't call an election. But the idea is now off the table, so Labour have to give that up, is really weird. I mean, again, it's like Fiona Bruce here. It's not just failing to inform the audience, she's misinforming the audience. The idea of general election is now implausible. Who says? After last week, I would say that no deal is 25%, 30% possible. I would say a second election, probably slightly less, like 20%, 25%. A second referendum, 15, 20%. A deal put forward by May with amendments getting through, 5%, very unlikely. So, there's lots of variables in motion. We're still not leaving for 2 months. The idea an election can't happen, it's just not correct. And the manner in which it's said seems almost intended to dismiss Diane Abbott as an illegitimate voice and nothing else. What's more, Isabel Oakeshott, again, comes in saying, hope isn't a political strategy, Diane. It's not hope. It's called baseline data. If something happens once, it can happen again. So despite what you say, Labour are polling either the same or ahead of the Tories, were they to make a similar improvement as we saw in the last general election, they would form a majority government. Clearly, if they pulled 10 points away, they'd win by 10 points in a general election. That's a big win for Labour. Now, nobody's saying that's going to happen or it's inevitable, but it's baseline data. Often pollsters or people engaged in research methods use baseline data as quite a legitimate way of creating inferences about what can happen in the future. For instance, we know the Labour Party is better at campaigning than the Tories. We know Jeremy Corbyn is better on the election trail than Theresa May. We know that because it's happened. And so the reasonable inference is that it can happen again. Doesn't mean it's going to happen again, but the idea that's hope is ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. Again, Fiona Bruce doesn't tell her to be quiet because we all know you only tell Diane Abbott to stop interrupting other people.
No, Diane Abbott.
Well, the Labour Party isn't calling for an extension of Article 50 because, as you heard, I think it's Institute of Government which said that there are, 12 separate bills that need to go through before the end of March.
But the question is it inevitable, given the lack of agreement and given that at the moment, clearly Theresa May and Jeremy aren't even talking, is it inevitable that it will be extended?
We have a government minister here. Maybe he can tell us how
well,
the government
I've asked
is going
Rory
to get
already.
through 12 separate bills between now and the end of March.
Hang on, let's not get into that level of detail. Simply the question is, will
Now this is unreal. Diane Abbott, again, like I say, throughout the show, she demonstrates that she's an authoritative, well-informed, coherent, rational voice, okay? She makes a very salient, important, well-informed point about government business. She's basically saying to Rory Stewart, you can't get this all through before March 29th, can you? And in his defence, he goes to answer it. At which point Fiona Bruce says, oh, this is too complicated, we can't talk about this. Well, what's the point of the programme? Again, Fiona Bruce repeatedly only comes to the rescue of Rory Stewart, the government minister, the government that's just been defeated by 230 votes in Parliament, the government which has lost the first finance bill for 40 years. She comes to his defence repeatedly while attacking Diane Abbott. She doesn't mention Isabel Oakeshott, who repeatedly interrupts Diane Abbott, and yet the one time Diane Abbott does it, it's a big issue and it's called out and we get applause from the audience. So I think over the whole show it's pretty clear that Fiona Bruce failed dramatically in her responsibilities as chair. I think we see throughout the 50 minutes a show that is replete with everyday sexism, everyday racism, and a systemic bias against socialist voices. Diane Abbott isn't taken seriously by the media establishment, or much of the media establishment, for a number of reasons. Firstly, she's a black woman. Secondly, she comes from a working class background. Thirdly, she isn't scared of them. And fourthly, she's a socialist. You put all of this together and you have a woman who the media establishment wants to lambast and undermine and demean at every opportunity. But this week's BBC Question Time was a nadir. It was a low point, and it certainly was beneath the BBC, which claims to be both impartial and accurate.